This is Miller Philosopher. So before I get started, I need to put a very clear disclaimer here that I did not like Amazon's Ring of Power series overall. The Numor costumes looked cheap. They did not say nor hint at that the fact that they live a very long time played a part in their steady downfall, and some of the changes to the lore, like the history of Mithril and Gil-galad being more of a schemer, made no sense to me. The hype surrounding it before it even came out was also a little bit too political for my taste, and it tainted the show for me overall. So having said that, this is not a channel that is dedicated to complaining or gatekeeping Lord of the Rings adaptations, books, and artists and other content creators. There's plenty of other channels and articles that you can go to that are dedicated to that, and feel free to do so if that's your thing. I'm not going to judge you. And I'm not going to judge any fan who happens to like Rings of Power, or I'm not going to call them fake Tolkien fans either, which I have seen. Again, that's gatekeeping, and I saw that with the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies when they came out, as well as other franchises to more extreme degrees, such as Star Wars, Star Trek, and even Marvel. So, having got it out of the way now, this video is about the elements that I feel that Rings of Power actually got right, or that I at least liked myself. Now, if that's too much for you, I understand. Feel free to bounce. That's perfectly fine. I respect your decision. That being said, what inspired me to do this, ironically, was I rewatched Fellowship of the Ring in the theaters not too long ago. And more specifically, I was at the scene where they arrive at the mines of Moria. Now, both in the book and the film, Moria is much, much less of a shadow of its former self. The grandeur of ancient dwarven architecture is still there, and that won't and cannot be erased. But it's also lifeless. It's dark. It's full of death, or at least the promise of death from hidden in dark corners and caverns unseen. And I felt that the movie did a great job hinting at how great the first and most ancient dwarven city of Middle-earth had once been. And when I first watched the movie back in 2001, I actually did feel some sense of loss. Like, wow, this must have been a glorious place. I wonder what it looked like. And that's what I was thinking as they're walking through the Great Hall and everything. It was just magnificent. Well, on that score, I think Rings of Power got that right. Finally seeing Khazad-dûm in its full glory. I felt that the creators did a great job of pulling a hard 180 and showing the city as being that full of life as it once was, showing the ingenuity of dwarven technology by using lamps to reflect sunlight into the mountain to grow plants, making canals and waterfalls to supply fresh water, and showing the dwarves as a proud culture in their prime, even down to their music. Now, I did enjoy the Hobbit trilogy as well, and I liked how they also showed a version of this with flashbacks of the Lonely Mountain before Smaug took it over. But, and this is not a complaint, I felt that they did not fully show the glory of dwarven culture overall. Khazad-dûm was supposed to be the single greatest dwarven mansion of all time. They had a lifestyle and customs that was as equally as glorious as the elves and the Numenoreans. And this was not and probably couldn't be shown because that's too much effort and it didn't apply to the story at that time. Yeah, we got the proud armies of the dwarves and that was freaking great, but not much more than that. And Rings of Power was able to expand upon that. Going back to the music aspect, it was loaded with the same heavy dwarf tones that I would come to expect of dwarves, basically. Yet at the same time, it was much more proud, more loud, more boastful. It said, "Look at us and wonder. We are the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and you will show us respect." It was, like I said, a hard 180 from what we saw in 2001 or Fellowship of the Ring. On a similar vein, another aspect that Rings of Power I felt got right was the overall glory of Numenor, and linking that to the movie adaptation of Gondorian technology. Fellowship of the Ring does a great job of showing the wonders of Gondor and ancient Numenorean architecture that it was based off of, carving out immense structures of the Argonath from the sides of the cliff face along the river, for example, and Minas Tirith itself being also carved out of the White Mountains, so that it pretty much looks like, and probably is, part of the mountain itself. Rings of Power took this idea and ran with it, showing what the true heritage of Gondor and Arnor looked like when their ancestors were at their prime. Even bigger buildings and even more massive architectures in this super huge metropolis. This was not Minas Tirith. Hell, this was not even Osgiliath, which was supposed to be the original capital of Gondor and was said to be one of the most glorious cities in its own prime. This was Numenor, and it was truly glorious. And if nothing else that I didn't like about the Numenorean plotline, I felt that this backdrop of the surrounding overall culture of Numenor, at least from a distance, deserves much respect. It was great seeing that put to screen, and it also communicates much more about the mindset of the Numenoreans and in the book how and why they fell, like where they were coming from pretty much. What I also liked too was the deep cuts it made to the First Age with glimpses of heirlooms from the Edain of the First Age, and showing how Numenor was also a repository for the legacy of their ancestors. Seeing that put to screen, it made me truly appreciate how the Silmarillion and the Fall of Numenor talk about this pride that the Numenoreans felt in their own culture and heritage, when put together with, like I said before, the overall scenery of Numenor itself. That when the Numenoreans talk about being the proud heirs of the Edain and the sufferings and what they accomplished in the First Age despite all odds, seeing these elements put to screen really brought that understanding home to me, and it really hammered home just why they had such big heads, I guess you can say. I totally get it now. Also, the prologue showing Valinor for the first time with the city of Tirion and the two trees was short but masterful. In that short amount of time, it communicates in itself the glory of the Eldar when they were at their prime, at least when they were the ones that were back in Valinor and what they left behind. In my own imagination, I had never pictured the two trees of Valinor, despite being magical, I guess, that lit up and being so massive that it practically covered the land. I didn't see it like that for whatever reason. And then on top of all that, seeing this giant shadow of Morgoth, without even mentioning his name, mind you, suddenly and slowly looming over them and depicting destruction of the trees, and then what Valinor looked like after that, I felt really communicated how spiteful Morgoth was and why the residents of Valinor were in such deep mourning and fear after the trees were killed. The darkness and despair was laid on really heavy in this short but very epic and important scene. I also enjoyed seeing the Southrons, I guess you can say the original inhabitants of Mordor before it was called Mordor. That these people who were not just not the good guys from the two previous trilogies, but were also descendants of the bad guys from the novels, basically, the Easterlings, the people who fought for Morgoth, and obviously ended up on the losing side, and how their descendants pretty much had to live with that shame, I guess you can say. The Silmarillion says how the people of Middle-earth in the Second Age, outside of Numenor, were considered savage and backward before the Numerians arrived to teach them, and it was cool seeing this state in live action. Lastly, I enjoyed the depiction of Eregion, and how, while it was not as glorious as Tirion and Valinor, it was still glorious. It was glorious to see the Noldor of the Second Age in their prime, because in Fellowship of the Ring, the only thing we see of this once great elven realm is some ruins that the Fellowship passes by on their journey south. And while The Hobbit does a better job of showing Rivendell in its glory and kind of hinting at what the rest of Eregion may have looked like, it was still a shadow of what had once been. And the book talks about this even in a more depressing manner, how the land is still barren after thousands of years after the War of the Elves and Sauron had ended, and apparently that even the damn rocks still lament and reflect on the ancient greatness that was the last Noldor realm of Middle-earth. And Rings of Power did a great job of showing this at its prime and why the rocks were lamenting. I totally get it. Now, having said all that, these are the elements I thought that Rings of Power actually got right. I think, for me at least, that it also enhanced how I read the books as well, in that it better communicates the grandeur that Tolkien was trying to put to page, and that the loss of this ancient world is very heavy and truly heavy. Something that I did not get really from the trilogies, and even a little bit of the books themselves, because if you watch other videos, I often say how the average person of Middle-earth knew nothing about this heritage or history and pretty much probably didn't care. Unless they were long-lived and had known something about it, it has no effect on their daily lives. So therefore, while the author obviously talks about being this huge loss, in story, they're not going to care because it's just like that was long before their time. And then it was like how we would see ancient Greeks and Romans. Yes, their culture had an effect on us, but at the same time, it was 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Who the fuck cares? Basically, that's how the people, I think, saw the ancient world of Middle-earth. And seeing it now put to screen really communicates to me, like, this is why it was a big deal. This is why it was just this huge loss. Having said all that, while I think Rings of Power did get other stuff right, it's also why it hurt the series so much to see them drop the ball. No, I'm not going to go shitting on the actors or who are just basically doing their job. And to be honest with you, several of them actually did a really great job portraying their characters, if I'm being totally honest. It's just that most of these positives for me are related to backdrop and setting. And I feel like if the writers had put in as much effort into the continuity of their writing and several of the characters as the artists clearly did in creating the backdrops of the series, then Rings of Power may have been that much better. But having said all that, and then if you made it through this, what do you think? If you saw or could tolerate Rings of Power, were there elements about it that you appreciated or liked? Or was it just all totally garbage to you and a betrayal of Tolkien somehow? Let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher. You all have a good day.